So let's begin by reminding you that test number 3 rolls around next Tuesday. How many of you guys forgot that test 3 was next Tuesday? Thank you for being honest. All right, so the lay of the land in terms of the breakdown for the questions on test 3 is listed there. 8 questions on intelligence. We did that before spring break. Development, we did an online session before spring break. You had a recording to view either before or after spring break, so if you haven't done that yet, you definitely need to do that. Today is emotion, stress, and health. One day, parts of 2 chapters today. And then on Thursday online, we'll do 1 day, 1 online session on personality. So it's relatively evenly balanced across these 4 sections. It's not like test 1 where we had a lot of bio or test 2 where we had a lot of learning. It's pretty evenly balanced across those 4 chapters. Okay. Other announcements. I know that the mid-semester deadline has now passed for research participation, and if you did 2 or more hours without any unexcused no-shows for the research studies, then you're eligible for 7 points of extra credit. I haven't received the list from the people that are in charge of that, so those points will show up in Blackboard. Sorry. They'll show up in Blackboard after they send me that list. So you don't need to pester me and ask me about where are those points. I'll post them once they give them to me. Okay? The only other announcement that's important will be after the test next Tuesday, the CFA, the California Faculty Association, is planning this strike for Thursday and Friday and then the beginning of the next week. That is not relevant to us. I'm going to be teaching the course as I normally teach it, so we have an online session next Thursday after test number 3. We have a live face-to-face class session 2 weeks from today on the 19th in here. So we are going to have class. I'm not participating in the strike. I'm going to be here doing what I need to do with you guys. Okay? Any questions about any of that housekeeping stuff before we get rolling here? One final thing I want to do before we start into emotion, stress, and health is give you the tip of the week. It is Camille's turn to be the tip of the week person, so here's her video where she's going to suggest something that would be good for you guys to do in preparation for test number 3 now.
Hi, my name's Camille. I'm a second semester SI leader for Psych 101 with Dr. Lamikis. My major is psychology, so I'm really excited to be able to help all of you this semester. And my tip of the week for you is to remember the learning curves and to make sure you do them before the tests because they can be really good practice and they never stop generating new questions.
To learn more, check out the supplemental instruction button on Blackboard.
He's very excited, and here's that button. So on that button again is the link to the calendar, and if you do the week view, you can see when everybody's holding their sessions. All right? Good deal. All right, here we go, guys. Moving into the section on emotion, stress, and health. So this is parts of 2 different chapters. There's still too much mumbling, so I'm going to wait. 2 different chapters. One chapter is on emotion. You guys will have some learning curves related to that. And then the other chapter is on stress and health. I blend this all together into one session, bless you, where we cover these 4 major topics today. So we're going to begin with a review of 4 major theories of emotion. And I guarantee you that's 2 or 3 test questions regarding being able to distinguish between and among those different theories of emotion. We'll talk briefly about the biology of emotion. So we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, the amygdala, and one other structure that we haven't talked about before in that part this morning. We'll do a segment on stress and coping, where we look at ways of categorizing different kinds of stressors and different kinds of coping responses. And then in the last 15 minutes or so, we'll do a section on the effects of stress on health. And how prolonged stressors can have a negative impact on health. The overall heading for this is health psychology. This would be a good thing to know. Like maybe I'll ask you a test question that says, what is this all about? Health psychology or behavioral medicine is really the overlap between psychology and medicine. So if you're interested in going to medical school, or you're interested in going into nursing or some other kind of medical discipline, this is the overlap between psychology and that stuff, okay, where we're talking about emotion, stress, and health. So again, health psychology or behavioral medicine, there are upper division courses in health psych within the department. So if you find this segment of the course really interesting, there's more courses you could take on it for sure. So let's begin with the theories of emotion. I'm going to lay them out on this slide in words, and then on the next slide I've got the pretty decent infographic from your textbook as well. We're going to review James Lang, Cannon-Bard, Schachter-Singer, and something called the cognitive appraisal model. Okay? So lots of names here to get connected in with these different theories. Excuse me. The big idea will be for you guys to make sure that you can distinguish between and among these different theories. James and James Lang is William James. From week 1 of the course, we talked about Wundt and the structuralist, and James and the functionalist. That name is going to come up there. When we get into Cannon-Bard, the little cheat sheet item for Cannon-Bard is going to be the fact that any question that is about the Cannon-Bard theory is going to have the word thalamus in it. Because as we're going to see, it's the only of the theories that is that explicit about a specific brain area and its relevance to emotion. So we'll talk about that in a bit. The Schachter-Singer theory you'll often hear referred to as the two-factor theory of emotion. Okay? We're going to talk about what those two factors are. This is the theory that in my mind I think of as the label and level theory of emotion. And I can't take credit for that. That was a student of mine at USD about 10 years ago now who came up with that way of thinking about that model. Okay? So I'm going to spell these out by running through what's in the infographic from the textbook, and then we're going to do a couple of clicker questions that will give you a good sense of what this will look like when I ask you guys some test questions next Tuesday on these theories of emotion. So this is infographic 9.3 from your textbook. Let me make the ink a darker color so we can actually see it here. So the first theory is the James Lang theory of emotion. And up above in the little bubble here, they've got a really nice sort of encapsulated summary of what that theory is about. It says here that body changes lead to emotions. The James Lang theory of emotion is that body changes lead to emotion. The other word you can use with James Lang is it's the somatic theory of emotion. So somatic means related to your body, right? The somatic theory of emotion says something like this. We encounter some kind of emotion eliciting stimulus. It could be a shark if we're swimming. It could be a spider. It could be some kind of news story on the TV or something that we're reading. There's a trigger. In the face of that trigger, this theory says what happens is we have a physiological response, and it's that physiological response alone that leads to the emotion. And in this case, the emotion is fear, because you're swimming along and you encounter a shark. Okay? So this somatic theory of emotion basically argues that the body informs the mind. Okay? The body informs the mind. What you don't see in the James Lang theory is anything about the thalamus and anything about any kind of cognitive processing, right? Notice that with James Lang, there's nothing about thinking going on. It's, here's what happened that triggered a physiological reaction which drives your emotional response. That's it. It's the simplest of these models. Okay? The somatic theory of emotion says it's purely driven by the physiological reactions. Here's a quote from William James that I think really spells this out. He said, "We feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike," and here's the best part, "afraid because we tremble." Okay? We feel afraid here because we're trembling there. So it's just the physiological piece that is driving emotion, and that's it. Okay? So any question that is trying to exemplify the James Lang theory won't have anything in it other than just that physiological piece. It's a really stripped down, very simple model. Okay? I'm going to contrast that with the cognitive appraisal model at the end here. Next up on the parade is the Cannon-Bard theory. This is the one where I said, the cheat sheet way of doing this is to look for the word thalamus. And this is where the word thalamus is going to come in. So what does this theory say? This theory says that the body changes and emotions happen together. And the way that they happen together is after encountering the shark, the thalamus simultaneously is sending a message to the underlying physiological organs, that is like your gut, okay, your heart, your lungs, etc., and it's sending a message to the overlying cerebral cortex. Okay, so we've got a trigger here from the thalamus to both the internal organs and the overlying cortex. So any question, again, that is about the Cannon-Bard theory is going to have the word thalamus. We're simultaneously triggering the gut and the brain. And if you contrast this with that first James Lange theory, what's the difference here? The difference is the James Lange theory says physiology first, then emotion. What does Cannon-Bard say? Physiology and emotion are happening when? At the same time. Okay? So simultaneously, we have physiological responses, heart rate, breathing, dry mouth, sweaty palms, all that kind of stuff, occurring at the same time as the emotion of fear or anger or whatever the case might be, sadness and so forth. Okay? So Cannon-Bard has those two things occurring at the same time as a function of this triggering by the thalamus. The third theory, Schachter-Singer, the two-factor theory. Let me just put that up top here, because you'll see this called the Schachter two-factor theory a lot. It says here that our thoughts about our body changes lead to emotions. Our thoughts about our body changes lead to emotions. So same stimulus here, you're encountering the shark. You have the heart rate and other physiological responses occurring. Then you have some kind of cognitive labeling going on. And that cognitive labeling is about what it is that I'm feeling. So this is where the label comes in. It's cognitively driven. And the label answers the question, what is it that I'm feeling? Okay, is it anger? Is it sadness? Is it fear? Is it frustration, etc.? The level is driven by the physiological response. So the level part of this label and level theory is physiologically driven, and it answers the question, how much am I feeling whatever it is that I'm feeling? Okay, so here's the way I think about the two-factor theory. The cognitive piece, which means the thinking piece, is what determines what emotional neighborhood, if you will, that you place yourself in. Okay? Is this anger? Is it sadness? Is it fear? What is it? That's driven by higher level cognitive processing. And then how much I feel, whatever I've determined that I'm feeling, is driven by how intense is the physiological reactivity. Okay? How much is the heart thumping in my chest? How rapidly am I breathing? How dry is my mouth? How much are my hands shaking? How sweaty are my palms? Those things determine how much I'm feeling. What am I feeling? Well, that's the cognitive factor, right? And those two things together, that's why it's called the two-factor theory, jointly produce the outcome here, the emotion of fear. Okay? Let me give you a scenario for this one, right? It's the same one I always use, so if you've heard it before, sorry. Let's pretend it's Valentine's Day. We'll go back 6-7 weeks, okay? You're in a kind of dark, candlelit restaurant with this person that you're on this date with, and at some point during the meal, he or she picks up a knife. Okay. So, we've got to figure out, first of all, what am I feeling? And then we've got to figure out, second of all, how much am I feeling that? Well, given the context, that is Valentine's Day, you're on a date, let's assume that's going pretty well, okay? When they pick up the knife, what is it that you're feeling? Is it fear or is it some kind of attraction? What are we going to go with? Let's go with attraction. Okay? you're not really thinking, oh, she's going to stab me now, right? So that's the cognitive piece, right? What is it? You evaluate the situation and you determine where am I landing in terms of this emotion, okay? So what is it that I'm feeling? And then what happens is the physiological piece determines the intensity of that emotion. Does that make sense? So it's sort of like the cognitive piece tells you what it is, and then on the dial within those various emotions, where you are on that dial is driven by the physiological piece. Okay? If your heart is really racing, your mouth is so dry that you can't speak, it's a lot of, well, we labeled it attraction. Okay? Or if you want to make this, a bad scenario, it's fear because I'm pretty sure she's going to stab me. And I'm feeling that a lot in terms of this physiological piece. So there's two elements here that are playing a role in ultimately producing the emotion of fear or sadness or whatever the case might be. Yeah. Yeah, so this one is really a question of the arrow to the stimulus is evaluating, like I was just saying, that situation, right? Like for the shark situation, like does it look like it has a lot of teeth? Is it really big? Does it look hungry? Am I bleeding? Right? Those would all be things that would, in terms of that stimulus, be relevant. So that cognitive label, really, I sort of tried to ignore that. It's assessing and evaluating both the situation and then coming up with a label for what's going on there physiologically. Does that make sense? Good question. Okay? So we've got that model. That's clearly more complicated, right? This one is like, oh, your heart's racing. It's fear. Okay? This one is those two things are happening at the same time, and it's produced by the thalamus. The final model here says cognitive appraisal is what's driving what's happening, and the little summary up top says our thoughts about our situation lead to emotion. So same stimulus, there's a cognitive appraisal, there's some kind of thinking and evaluating what's going on. And there, again, there's the arrow pointing up, right? What I'm evaluating is that situation, that stimulus. Is it a big shark? Does it look hungry, etc.? And what happens is the emotion is a product just of the cognitive piece. What's missing in this fourth and final theory here? What do you not see in the infographic? There's no heart, right? There's no physiological response piece. So really, if you look at the first and the fourth, they're the two simplest ones, right? The first one says the emotion is physiologically driven. The fourth one says it's cognitively driven. And the two in the middle sort of do variations on that, right? The second model says these two things are actually happening simultaneously. The third model is the most complex one. If you ask me which of these do I think makes the most sense, I really think it's this third one, right? This third one has both the physiological piece and the cognitive piece. There are these neat feedback loops where we're evaluating not only the physiological responses but also the situational variables. And the emotion is kind of a complicated product. Okay? It's not just physiology, it's not just cognitive appraisal, it's both of those factors playing a role. Okay? All right. Any questions about any of those four theories as we laid them out? Okay, so what I want to do is a couple of clicker questions where we practice what I'm going to ask you guys to do next Tuesday, see how this turns out. We're again going to be on channel AA, so press and hold the power button. Make sure you get the AA thing for our channel. How about this first one? I thought I started it, but I didn't. There we go. 10-year-old Vito tells his friend, when your knees knock, your hands sweat, and your stomach is in knots, then you really get scared. Which theory are we illustrating with that statement? Is that James Lang, Cannon-Bard, cognitive appraisal, or Schachter two-factor? See if you can eliminate one or two of these theories because they emphasize something that Vito is not describing as being relevant to the emotion here. If you do that, that will help you. All right, last 10 seconds here. Wow, I must have taught it even better to you guys, because that's even better than 8 o'clock did. So this is James Lang. Somebody tell me in your own words why it's James Lang this time around. What's there, what's not there that led you to choose A? Thank you. Okay, so he's describing physiological responses, knees knocking, hands sweating, stomachs in knots. Really good. So the line is from that then to feeling scared. That's perfect. So you've got it. Okay? That's somebody to sit near during the test next week for the emotion questions. Let's do another one. And I apologize, this is the longest question stem of the semester up top. Astrid was physiologically aroused by a TV horror movie. She's watching something scary. She became extremely angry when her younger brother momentarily blocked her view of the screen. She gets annoyed because she's trying to see what's happening. When her movie viewing was interrupted by a phone call from her boyfriend, however, she experienced unusually intense romantic feelings. Oh, I love him, right? Her different emotional reactions to her brother and her boyfriend are best explained by which theory here? So think about that. She's physiologically aroused by the movie. She gets annoyed. She gets angry with the brother. She feels romantic attraction kinds of feelings when the boyfriend calls. What's going on there? Which theory best explains that? Alrighty. We're a little bit split here between A and D. Okay? Between A and D. The correct answer is actually going to be A. Who can explain to me why this is a two-factor thing? Where are the two factors? What's going on here that led you to choose A? Anybody? You're all just staring at me. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so she's differentiating between the anger with the brother, the attraction to the boyfriend. So that's the second factor, right? That's the cognitive label. Where's the physiological stuff? Where'd that come from?
She's getting intense emotion.
What does it say in that very first sentence? Yeah, she's got the physiological arousal. What was the trigger for that? The scary movie has her all worked up. She's like, oh no, that girl's going down in the dark basement. Oh no. Right? And then the boyfriend, not the boyfriend gets in the way, the brother gets in the way. She's like, I can't see what's happening. She's annoyed. Right? So the two pieces are the physiology from the movie. Right? So there's the level. How much am I feeling? Well, what am I feeling? Anger because my brother gets in the way, or romantic feelings towards the boyfriend when he calls. Okay? So those are the two factors relevant there. The reason it's not D, cognitive appraisal, is what's included here that's not part of the cognitive appraisal model. The physiological piece. You guys see that now? So that's the key. I think the key little phrase is physiologically aroused right off the start. Okay? That's not part of the cognitive appraisal piece. All right. Any questions about either of those two items? That's what I'm going to have you guys do. Right. So the question is in there two? So two triggers. The trigger physiologically is the movie puts her somewhere physiologically, and then the emotion is a function of evaluating what's going on in the situation. And sort of going back here to the arrow that points back up to the shark. like you asked when we were looking at this, right? So it's annoyance or anger because my brother is making it so I can't see this. Or it's something else because the boyfriend calls and I'm attracted to this guy. It's kind of like the restaurant example, right? I'm either attracted to her or I'm scared because of the knife that's in her hand. Okay? So it's always going to have those two pieces. I think the key thing is this is the only model that's got physiology and thinking, right? Everything else has one, or the other, right? Nobody has two of these across these theories other than that two-factor theory. All right, good. Let's talk about the biology of emotion. Let's begin with the first part, which is something we already know a fair amount about, and then we'll drill down into some stuff that's a little bit newer as I rip the microphone off my ear. I was dangerous there. All right. Emotions, we know, are linked with autonomic nervous system activity. So if you don't remember ANS, that stands for autonomic nervous system. We talked about this before when we talked about sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So emotion has to do with things like heart rate and breathing and sweaty palms, etc. Okay, if you've ever been in a situation that made you feel really, really nervous or really, really excited or scared or sad or angry, right? If you think back on that, I'm betting you can identify some of those ANS activations that are really part of the sympathetic division, more so than parasympathetic. So remember, sympathetic is fight or flight. The heart rate, the breathing, and all that stuff gets ramped up. In fact, let me just bounce down and show you that with this slide. Okay, so with the sympathetic division activation occurring here, what's going on is this dad is concerned that the little boy is about to fall off the dock here. He's walking down the end of the dock. He's going to fall off. Oh, and they're making it clean, but there's a shark fin right there. Okay, and the dad's concerned that this is going to be the second child that gets eaten by a shark, and his wife's going to be really, really pissed. All right, so if that's going on, he's going to be doing fight or flight. I'm just going to write here F or F. Fight or flight, activation of the sympathetic division. His pupils dilate. His mouth gets really dry. He's sweating. He's breathing really rapidly. His heart is thumping in his chest. And oh, thank God over here, he didn't die. That's good. Parasympathetic, we said, was time of peace, if you remember from that discussion in the Chapter 2 bio section, right? So things are now calming down. Things are slowing down. So his breathing is decreasing, his heart rate is slowing, and so forth. Okay? So emotions are connected with things like that. And we can measure this pretty easily. Little finger pulse monitors and other things to measure heart rate and breathing and so forth pretty easily can give us a gauge as to what's going on this dimension. Okay? The second element here biologically is the amygdala. So the amygdala was one of our three limbic system structures, along with the hypothalamus and the hippocampus. The amygdala is involved in emotion in a couple different ways. Number one, it helps us process the emotional significance of stimuli, right? Is it emotionally significant or not? Basically, like, does it matter? Okay? So if you were to look down right now and notice that one of your shoes is untied, that usually doesn't make people get really, really sad and start crying. Okay? The amygdala helps you figure out, like, yeah, that's not such a big deal. Versus if you're at your grandmother's funeral, that is a big deal. Okay? That's emotionally significant. The amygdala will basically stamp those things that are really relevant. Right? The birth of your first child, that will be stamped, and you're not going to forget that. Okay? The students who attend the two schools that were in a championship game last night that ended just incredibly, either way, they're not going to forget either making that shot and winning that game or losing that game at the last second. Right? That's going to be stamped for many of them for a long, long time. Generates immediate emotional and behavioral reactions to things. Okay? So those immediate responses to these emotionally significant situations is modulated by the amygdala. I think the coolest part of this, in terms of what the amygdala does for emotion, is that if you were to damage the amygdala, you would have impairments in fear conditioning. The classical conditioning that we talked about, with our old pal, little Albert. You know what? Little Albert would not have learned to be afraid of the furry white rat and wouldn't have had that fear generalized to other furry white objects if only he had had a damaged amygdala. Okay? So this is a weird thing to think of, but fear conditioning via classical conditioning doesn't unfold correctly if the amygdala is damaged. We know this from animal studies and other studies with humans who have had strokes that damage the amygdala and so forth. What happens is, with the humans, they don't learn to be afraid. They don't get more wary over time. Okay? If they're playing some game where it's like a gambling kind of scenario and they keep losing and they keep losing and they don't start betting less. They just keep doing whatever it is that they were doing. They don't slow things down because the fear conditioning doesn't unfold the way that it otherwise would. Okay? So that's the second part, the amygdala. We know a fair amount about that already. The piece that's most new here on this slide is this segment of your frontal lobe known as your orbitofrontal cortex. This is the longest term in the whole lecture today. Orbitofrontal cortex. That just means it's a part of the frontal lobe that's right behind your eye orbit. Okay, so the orbit is this bone that surrounds your eyeball, and basically right in and right up from that is where you've got this part of the brain that is related to processing emotional cues. Basically, the way to think about this orbitofrontal cortex is it's what helps you read other people's reactions to things, other people's emotional states. So it says here, it's especially those related to interpersonal interactions. Okay? So if you're having lunch today with your friend, and she talks about how her I don't want to pick on grandmothers, her grandfather is really sick and in the hospital, and she's worried about him. And she starts getting teary as she talks about that. Okay? If you have an intact orbitofrontal cortex, you'll read that social cue and respond appropriately. Okay? If for some reason you had damage to the orbitofrontal cortex, you had had a stroke or maybe a head injury, a concussion that damaged this, you would potentially have an inappropriate reaction. So what would be an inappropriate reaction there? She's getting really teary and upset thinking about and worrying about her grandfather. What might you do? You might laugh, right? You might make fun of her. Okay, you might start giggling. Those are not the things you're supposed to do. So what's wrong? Well, what's wrong is this brain area that helps you read that situation and respond appropriately is not working the way that it should. Okay? So this orbitofrontal cortex, again, I'll show you on the slide. It's basically right in and right up from where your eyeball is within your frontal lobe. Let's look at these geographically in the brain. So there it is. Your eyeball would be sort of down here over the word hypothalamus, in and up from where. That is your orbitofrontal cortex. There's the amygdala, again, part of the limbic system structure. It's not really lime green in your head, but it's there. Hippocampus we talked about in memory. There's the thalamus. We mentioned it today with the Cannon-Bard theory. It's simultaneously sending a message up and sending a message down to your internal organs. So those are some of the brain parts that we've been talking about briefly today. All right? Cool. Questions on these three biological underpinnings for emotion? Make sense? I just want to point out briefly this nice little infographic here from the textbook about fear and fear responses. So she's encountering a snake. We've got the cat encountering the rat here. Here's a nice little scan looking at the amygdala lighting up in red here. So we've got what's called a frontal view where we sort of slice it front to back. We're looking into the brain here and seeing the amygdala lighting up in response to some kind of fear-provoking stimulus. Okay? All right, so that's the segment on emotions, theories of emotion, and the biology of emotion. Now I want to talk about stress and coping, but I'm going to give you an easy clicker question first. As a professor distributed the test to the class, Blair's heart starts to pound and her palms start to sweat. What's driving that? Is that sympathetic, central, somatic, or parasympathetic in that situation? All righty, last couple seconds here. All right, that was an easy one, right? Sympathetic is fight or flight. You guys got that nailed down. Good. All right, now, we're going to move into the section on stress and coping. We're going to spend about 15, 20 minutes on this, 15, 20 minutes on stress and health, and then we'll be good to go. Move into personality on Thursday. I'm going to begin by helping you get a little more precise with the words that you use when we talk about stress and coping. I'm willing to bet that many of you use the word stress when you actually mean to be talking about stressors. Because stressors are the things that go on in your life that lead to a stress response. So I think a key thing to remember with stress is, in terms of health psychology and behavioral medicine, we think about stress as a response to stimulus events, to things going on that disturb your equilibrium or exceed your ability to cope. Okay? So the test next Tuesday isn't stress, it's a stressor. Okay? The fact that your car doesn't start is a stressor, right? The fact that your flight is delayed is a stressor. Like, oh, I'm under so much stress. Well, technically, and to be more precise, what you should say is, I'm facing a significant number of stressors. Okay? Because those are the triggers that lead to then a stress response. Now, in the face of those different stressors, the test or the car problems or a delayed flight or whatever, right? The stress response can include a bunch of things. It could include an emotional component where what happens is you become more easily irritable. You get angry more quickly. Okay? That's part of the stress response. Part of the stress response might be you have a hard time sleeping. Okay? So if you're somebody that gets nervous about flying, maybe you notice that part of your stress response is you don't sleep particularly well the night before your flight. Maybe part of your stress response is when you got a paper due and a test and a quiz and all this academic pressure, you get headaches or backaches or you're stiff, right? You've got some kind of physiological thing that you notice as part of your stress response. Then in the face of the stressor, many times what people will try to do is cope with it in some way. And we're going to talk about different categories for thinking about stressors and then thinking about coping responses. So the key phrase here is your efforts to deal with these demands, right? So in the face of the test coming up next Tuesday, one of your coping responses might be what? What might you do? Anybody? What might you do in preparation for the test next Tuesday? You might study. Imagine that. That's a coping response, right? You might go to the gym. You might go to an SI session. You might read the textbook. You might make flashcards on Quizlet. Whatever. You might do learning curve quizzes, right? All of those would be representing coping responses. You might go to dinner with a friend of yours. What does that have to do with the test? I don't know, but I feel better after I do that. Okay? That's my coping response. So the stressor is the trigger that will lead to a stress response and many times some sort of effort on your part to cope with the demands of that situation. Does that make sense? So I think typically the imprecision in layperson's terms is they use the word stress when they're really talking about stressors, right? So you want to talk about your concerns about your roommate or your grandma or your finances or your physical health. Those are all stressors that could lead to a stress response and could lead to your trying to cope with them in some way. All right, here's what I want to do. On this slide, I want to talk about 4 different dimensions on which we could characterize different stressors. So we could talk about their intensity. And not surprisingly, I'm going to give you another continuum here because we do that all the time in this course. There are low intensity, low severity stressors, and there are high intensity, high severity stressors. Okay? The untied shoelace is what kind of a stressor? Low severity. If that knocks you off track for the rest of the week, you're going to have a difficult life. Okay? That's a low-intensity stressor. If your clicker falls off your desk, that's a low-intensity stressor. Typically, nobody cries, but typically that happens like 6 times a class. Okay? It falls off, no big deal, right? If you are in a combat region in the military, you're in a war zone, that's a big deal. That's a high-intensity, high-severity stressor, right? If your husband or wife or mom or dad or son or daughter is undergoing heart surgery right now, that's a big deal. That's a high-intensity, high-severity stressor. See the difference? Right? Some things are a big deal. Oh, I have a hangnail. That's not a high-severity stressor. That's not a big deal. Okay? Next question is, how long is it going to last? Okay? And let's try to scale this the same way so that the less bad things are on the left and the more demanding things are on the right. So duration, we would put short-term over here, and then we put long-term over here. Short-term stressors versus long-term stressors, right? If you literally have to rip off a Band-Aid, that's a short-term stressor, right? It sucks, it hurts, but it's just like that, right? Versus if you have a long-term ongoing stressor, you're in combat. You're in the combat zone for the next 9 months. That's a big deal. It's a high-intensity stressor, and it's pretty long-term. A long-term stressor might be some chronic health condition that you need to deal with. A long-term stressor might be, a parent or a grandparent with Alzheimer's disease, and you're going to be dealing with that for years and years. Okay, those are long-term ongoing stressors that, again, on the right side here, feel even more demanding. Dimension number 3 here has to do with predictability. So if we're putting the more overwhelming stuff on the right side here, what's more overwhelming? Something that's predictable or something that's unpredictable? Unpredictable is generally thought to be worse, right? More overwhelming. So we're going to put unpredictable over here, and we're going to put predictable on the left side here. Okay? What's an example of a predictable stressor? Something that you can anticipate, something that's scheduled. The test next Tuesday is predictable. Unless something really weird happens, we're going to have that test, right? The only way that's not going to happen is if we have some giant wildfire or something, right? Several years ago, my students in the fall, we had the wildfires, referred to it as Fire Week. Well, if we have Fire Week next week, then we won't have the test. But barring Fire Week or some other major natural disaster, that's happening next Tuesday. There's the clicker, right? It's predictable. What's unpredictable? Can somebody give me an example of an unpredictable stressor? What do you guys got? Raise your hand so I can hear, because when you just mumble, I can't get it. Someone suddenly dying who was not sick and on their deathbed. That's an unpredictable stressor. What's another one? Car accident. What about earthquakes? Are they predictable? No, right? So we can't anticipate these things. That's why they're falling on the right side of the scale here, where we've got high intensity, long-term, and now unpredictable stressors. Fourth and final dimension is how controllable is it? What's worse, guys? Things that are controllable or things that are uncontrollable? Yeah, uncontrollable. That sucks, right? When you're stuck in traffic or your plane is delayed or something else is going on with the weather that's messing up your life, that's an uncontrollable stressor. That goes over here. Controllable goes on the left side here. There's another clicker taking a dive. Okay? So controllable stressors are things over which you have some control, right? So maybe we'd put it here along the continuum. If you're having financial problems, there are aspects of that that are controllable. Like if part of your financial problem is the fact that you spend $10 at Starbucks every day and you have no money, well, stop spending $10 at Starbucks every day, right? That's a controllable aspect of that problem. Uncontrollable, again, something that you can't change. If the announcement at the gate for the flight is we're going to be delayed 2 hours because of bad weather, you have no control over that, right? If you're driving to Vegas and they shut down 15 North and there's a life flight helicopter several miles ahead sitting on the road, you cannot control that, right? You're stuck in and trying to move one car ahead. It's useless. You're not going anywhere, right? It's an uncontrollable stressor, something that you can't change in any way, okay? What we're going to do with this final dimension is we're going to come back to talk about controllability after we talk about coping responses, because it turns out that certain coping responses are a better fit if something is controllable, and others are a better fit if that thing you're dealing with is uncontrollable, okay? Start thinking about that, right? How would you want to respond if the problem is controllable versus if the problem is uncontrollable? What would you want to do differently in those two situations? All right? Any questions about these different dimensions here? So what's the worst kind of stressor? Right down the right side here. High intensity, long-term, unpredictable, uncontrollable. Again, I just go back, to something like combat experience in a war. That fits, right? And not surprisingly, when you get lots of cases of post-traumatic stress disorder and stuff after wars like that, it's because we're putting these folks in situations where it's the worst of all possible scenarios in terms of those stressors. Okay? All right. Any questions on how we can characterize the different stressors? All right. Let's talk now about what people do for coping. We're going to talk about these three different types of coping strategies. Problem-focused, emotion-focused, and seeking social support. Let's figure out how these differ from each other. So here's the deal. Problem-focused coping is coping that involves active attempts to respond to the demands of the situation. I think problem-focused coping basically boils down to two words. Trying to fix it. Whatever it is. Okay? So problem-focused coping. Respond to the demands of the situation, trying to fix it, trying to do something active to solve the problem. Okay? For your test next Tuesday, what would be an example of a problem-focused coping response? What would you do? Study. Read the textbook. Do some learning curve quizzes. Go to an SI session. Form a study group with my friends. All of those are problem-focused coping strategies, right? Okay? If your car won't start, give me an example of a problem-focused coping strategy for that stressor. What do you do? Raise your hand and tell me, because when you mumble, I get nothing. You could do what if your car won't start? Thank you. See if the battery's dead. So I'm going to open up the hood and look in there and see if the battery's dead. Now, how do I do that? I don't know. Okay. My last car, I had the hood open 3 times. Once was by accident. So I don't know what's going on under there. It's really good to know what you know and you don't know. I know this stuff. I don't know anything about cars. That's fine. What else might you do? Your car won't start. Check the battery. I'm trying to fix the problem. I'm going to call AAA. I'm going to call my brother who knows how to fix cars, whatever the case might be. All these things are efforts to fix what's wrong. The contrast is between that and emotion-focused coping. Here's the deal, guys. With emotion-focused coping, you're not trying to solve the problem. You're trying to feel better. So emotion-focused coping is directed at minimizing emotional distress. Okay? What we're trying to do here is feel less bad. Okay? Look at the word distress. It's got the word stress in it. Right? So if we're trying to minimize emotional distress, what we're trying to do is feel less anxious, less angry, less overwhelmed, less sad. So here's the level of those feelings now. And then I do my emotion-focused coping, and you know what happens? That stuff goes away. What does that sound like from the learning chapter? That's negative reinforcement, isn't it? I feel really, really nervous. I feel really, really angry. I feel really, really sad. I do these things here, and all those feelings are gone. Okay? So emotion-focused coping is not about trying to solve the problem. It's about feeling better. So think about the test coming up in a week. If you're doing some kind of emotion-focused coping, what do you go and do that doesn't directly involve knowing more about psychology, but somehow makes you feel less bad about that? Less anxious, less concerned, etc. What might you do? What do you guys do to calm yourselves down when you're all worked up about something? You guys are not responsive at all. Thank you. I might exercise. I go to the gym. Okay? Is going to the gym going to help me know more about Piaget's model? No, but when I'm done, I feel less concerned about that stuff. What else might you guys do? So we're going to go to the gym. We're going to do some breathing exercises. Okay. I don't know anything more about these theories of emotion yet, but at least I don't feel like I'm going to have a heart attack. What else might I do? I might have a hobby. I might play the piano. I might do some other kind of relaxing activity. I might watch an episode of my favorite TV show. Okay? How many of you guys have ever eaten ice cream to help yourself feel better? Come on now. That's emotion-focused coping, right? That's about helping yourself feel better, right? Another example of emotion-focused coping might be, what I'm going to do to help myself feel better is I'm going to take a bath. That's generally not the guys. Guys are generally not like, dude, I'm going to go take a bath. I'm going to feel better. I'm going to get the beads and everything, right? But what you do is you feel better after doing that. So I don't know anything more about psych, but man, that was really good ice cream, whatever the case was. The final strategy here is seeking social support. It kind of defines itself, doesn't it? Right? So we engage our social support network, and what's cool about this is the people that give us the help might give us the help in either of those two flavors, right? So if you have a brother, an uncle, sister, cousin, whoever, who's awesome at fixing cars, you might call them up. You're using your social support network, and what they're giving you is a fix-it kind of problem-focused coping response, right? Something to give you a solution. Somebody else that you call up for support might be the one that wants to go to the gym with you or go and see your favorite movie or some other kind of activity, and just helps to calm you down, right? And this is really, really important, the social support piece. In this health psych literature, there's research on outcomes for folks who have and don't have social support for things like heart disease and other things. People who have that kind of social support, friends and family and loved ones, they live longer. They have much better outcomes than those who don't have people to turn to when stuff goes wrong. All right. Any questions about those three forms of coping responses that we might engage in? All right. Let's talk about this match idea. One of the big things I like to drive home here, because I think it's really important for your life, for real, even beyond this course, is knowing which of these two is a better fit when you think about the controllability of a stressor. Okay? So when you have an uncontrollable stressor right here, is it a better fit for you to do problem-focused coping or emotion-focused coping, again, when that thing is uncontrollable? What you should do emotion-focused, right? So I'm going to write EF down below here. Emotion-focused coping for uncontrollable stressors, problem-focused coping for controllable stressors. Right? What is this about? Well, if you're stuck on the freeway and the freeway is closed down, it doesn't do you any good to try to do problem solving. If your emotion-focused thing is to listen to jazz piano, great. Do that. If that calms you down, because you're not going anywhere, right? In that traffic jam or waiting at the gate at the airport for the 2-hour delayed flight. Whatever it is that calms you down, use that. If you're going to try to problem solve and make the rain go away, which is another uncontrollable stressor, it's a waste of time, right? In contrast, if it is something controllable, then do something, right? If you have a test coming up, read the book. Do the quizzes, right? Do those things that will solve the problem for that stressor that's not completely controllable, right? I'll admit that maybe that falls somewhere in the middle, right? A test, you don't know exactly what questions, but you have a pretty good sense of what things are more or less important. So to the degree that you can, you want to use those problem-focused, active, problem-solving kinds of coping responses, okay? By the way, this is the underpinning of the serenity prayer that probably a lot of you guys have heard of, right? To change the things I can change, accept the things I can't change, and have the wisdom to know the difference. It's this stuff, right? So I'm going to use problem-focused coping when it's controllable, if I'm going to accept the things I can't change, that's emotion focus for uncontrollable stressors, and have the wisdom to know the difference. It's being able to figure out whether it's controllable or uncontrollable and then respond accordingly. Okay? And again, I think this is important, not just for a test question next Tuesday, like in your life. Like if you spend a lot of time doing problem-focused coping for things that are beyond your control, you're just banging your head against the wall. Okay? It's not a good way to be. And coming up with more emotion-focused strategies that help you when things are uncontrollable is a hugely important skill to have. All right? Questions about that at all? Does that make sense? All right, cool. Final segment, last 20 minutes. We're going to talk about Hans Selye. He's the man, not the rat. Hans Selye develops a model about the effects of prolonged stress on health that's known as the General Adaptation Syndrome and has the rather unfortunate acronym of GAS. Okay? So he's got this GAS model that tries to show what happens when you have a long-term, ongoing, high-intensity, maybe uncontrollable, maybe unpredictable stressor. Okay? Maybe it's job-related. Maybe it's relationship-related. Okay? Maybe it's some other kind of stressor where it's going on for a long, extended period of time, and you're starting to see consequences on your health. Okay? You're getting sick all the time. You're having some kind of health problem that you didn't have before. It could be because of what's going on here. His model originally is developed based on his research with rats. What he did was he exposed the rats in his lab to a variety of different stressors. And actually the backstory on this is fascinating. He didn't set out to study this stuff, but he was so inept at handling his rats that became his thing. Like, he started stressing out his rats because he kept dropping them, and they would end up under the table, and he had to sweep them out with a broom. I'm not making this up. This is like a real thing. And he switched his focus of his research to, like, what happens when you, like, make a rat's life miserable? Okay? So he started exposing these rats to a variety of different stressors. Now, you might be sitting there like, okay, so how do you stress out a rat? Because, like, you put him in a giant rat traffic jam, or you give him really bad rat news, or here's what he did. He put the rats in different environments that would be more stressful. A really loud environment with lots of banging and construction noises versus a quiet environment. Right? A relatively normal temperature environment versus a really hot or really cold environment. My favorite of these stressors for the rats, not because I'm particularly sadistic, but it's a memorable one, is he put the rats in a little rat swimming pool. And that's what I'm drawing right here because that's an awesome picture of a rat swimming pool. And the rat swimming pool was filled with an opaque, kind of murky liquid that you couldn't see through down to the bottom, like, you know, the ocean in Hawaii or whatever, right? So here he is. He's got this rat, and he pops him into this little swimming pool. And right below the water line here is one little sort of platform that the rat could find and rest on. So he pops the rat into the little swimming pool, and if you don't know, rats really are not fond of swimming. Rat's all stressed out, swimming around. Oh, no, this is horrible. And he bumps into this platform. It's like, oh, thank God, right? And the rat just sort of stands on the platform. I'm good. What a relief. Selye comes over and goes, not so fast, Mr. Rat. He pulls him out, and then what he does is he moves the platform to somewhere else. Pops the rat back in. The rat's like, oh, shit, this is horrible. Where's the platform? And he comes over, and the platform's not there. Oh, damn it, right? When you do that to a rat, you can actually cause the rats to get ulcers and infections and other things. So that's, if the question is how do you stress out a rat, that's how you do it. Okay? And what he found was something that became the building block for his three-step stage theory of the effects of prolonged stress on health called GAS, the General Adaptation Syndrome. The three stages spell out the word R, like, you know, we are happy, A-R-E. So this is an easy one to remember because it spells out a word that we know. So stress leads in the alarm stage to activity of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. This just means we activate that fight or flight response. in the alarm stage, the A part of R. Okay, and we know this. We've already talked about this today, right? The breathing becomes more rapid. Our palms get sweaty. Our mouth gets dry and all that stuff. In this initial sort of shock to the system, this initial jolt to the system here. I sort of picture this as, this is when you first, maybe not literally physically, but when you're knocked back by some kind of news, right? Maybe the long-term ongoing stressor is you find out that your grandmother had a stroke and you're not sure what kind of functioning she's going to have in the aftermath of this. And that's a shock, right? That's the alarm stage when you initially find this out and you're like, no way, I can't believe that, that's horrible, right? Something like that. So that's the initial stage here. And it's just this stuff that we know a lot about now, right? Fight or flight, sympathetic division gets activated initially here. In stage 2, what happens is we're trying to utilize whatever resources we have at our disposal to battle against the demands of this situation. This is called the resistance stage. Okay? So when we're in the resistance stage, what we're trying to do here is mobilize whatever is available to us and battle whatever this stressor is. And the main thing that goes on during this resistance stage is the release of stress hormones, the most significant of which is called cortisol, and you'll read about this in the textbook as well. If you're a health psychology researcher who looks at stress and coping, one of your dependent variables you might measure is cortisol levels from a cheek swab of somebody who's maybe faced some specific kind of stressor. Okay? The good news with stress hormones is they're intended to be part of this resistance stage in the general adaptation syndrome. They're the emergency resources, right? Break the glass in the case of emergency. We break the glass and use what's there. The problem is, if this is being utilized over an extended period of time, days or weeks or months, right? What can happen is these stress hormones that are beneficial in the short term can cause problems in the long term. And one of the things that they do for us in terms of physical health is they suppress our immune functioning, which means what? What are we more susceptible to having happen? We're more likely to get sick. Okay? So we've got the suppression of the immune functioning. And so if your long-term ongoing stressor for maybe several weeks at the end of the semester is finals coming up and lots of papers due, you might find yourself being more susceptible to getting sick. Okay? If you think back to the fall, did you get sick? That finals exam week, you probably weren't alone. And it's driven by, again, this overutilization of this emergency system with cortisol, okay, and other stress hormones. This again makes me think of, I mentioned this in passing earlier in the semester, the book Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. What did I say then? Why don't zebras get ulcers? Because when do they use this stuff? Like when they're about to get eaten by the lion, right? Remember we said the zebra doesn't lie around and worry about paying the mortgage or why his zebra offspring don't look like him or any of that, right? It's only when, this is life or death, right? But when do we turn this stuff on? All the time and for like stupid stuff, right? And so we wear things out because we utilize emergency intended resources for things that are not emergencies, okay? All right, so that's the second stage. We're battling, we're fighting, and we're trying to resist the demands of the situation. Ultimately what happens is we deplete our resources, right? We start to run on empty, right? The gas tank is showing we're running on empty here. Well, in the exhaustion stage, that's what's happening in terms of our resources for coping with the demands of the situation. So we have a negative impact on health. We have a lowered resistance to disease, and we take longer to heal. This is just one example of this study with dental students. I guess since they are so often dealing out pain later on in their careers, there was a study done in health psych where they looked at dental students during high stress times like finals and low stress times like maybe spring break or in between semesters or something. And what they found was that their healing took longer during the high stress final exam week. Okay? And when you look at this and you see puncture wound, you're like, what did they do to these people? The puncture wound was like a finger prick. It wasn't like we took a chunk of skin out of their hand or their face or whatever, right? A little finger prick, it takes longer to heal during high stress finals week than it does, during the summer or between semesters in the fall and the spring or on spring break or whatever. Okay? So, again, the point here is when these prolonged stressors cause you to deplete the resources down to nothing, that's when you start seeing the impact on health. And I've got a slide that I want to show you guys that shows some specific health consequences when you do this repeatedly. And some of us do, right? Some of us turn the stuff on way too often, or we are, legitimately facing 3, 4, 5 really significant ongoing stressors, and we notice it. We notice we're getting sick more often. We notice other kinds of aches and pains and problems with our physical health. Let me jump and show you that slide before we do one final little clicker question. So some of the possible health reactions to stress. In the column on the left is a list of things that will happen in the face of different kinds of stressors. So blood vessel constriction, cardiac activity increasing, bronchial activity increasing, and on the right side is what you can get in terms of health consequences. If your immune system is depleted, okay, it's run down, you're more susceptible to ulcers and other infections. Okay? If you overdo the blood vessel constriction, remember one part of the sympathetic division activation was the squeezing in of the blood from the periphery. Remember that? Right? You squeeze it into the larger muscles, you get the tingling in your fingers and toes. If you overdo that again and again and again every day for weeks and months, you could be susceptible to hypertension. What is that? High blood pressure. You guys are always so young and don't know anything about this yet. Hypertension is high blood pressure. Everybody knows what the dreaded erectile dysfunction is. If you watch any TV shows, that's the only commercials we have now. Is these guys running around taking these pills and then whatever. Increased cardiac activity. You're making the heart race all the time too much. Makes you more susceptible to heart disease. Or bronchial activity with asthma, right? Either it could be causing the asthma or the asthma is sitting there, and then in the face of all these stressors, this could make it that much worse. Okay? I had an interesting question actually from one of the SI leaders after class about the connection between something like asthma and anxiety, right? So we've got proneness to anxiety and proneness to asthma. What might go on? What might go on is actually a feedback loop, right? Where when the asthma kicks on, it might make you get more anxious about that, which might make the asthma get worse, or maybe it's the other way around and it begins with some kind of anxiety driving the asthma symptoms, which might feed into that anxiety as well. Okay? So this is, again, not just for the hell of it that we're talking about this stuff. This is relevant to different kinds of health reactions you guys probably care about for sure. Let me just grab this other slide and then we'll do a final clicker question. This is a nice graphic showing visually here what goes on with the general adaptation syndrome. So the x-axis is the stage, alarm, resistance, exhaustion. Again, it spells ARE. Y-axis is your resistance to stress. Here's the initial shock to the system. It's the alarm stage. Initially, your resistance to stress drops, and then we start utilizing and deploying those resources. During the resistance stage, all hands on deck, basically, right? Whatever we've got, we're going to try to use to deal with the demands of this situation. And then we get to the exhaustion stage, and the reserves are not even just diminished. Sometimes they could be completely depleted, right? They're gone, and now we're susceptible to things like physical and other kinds of health consequences. So if you like that graphic, it's another way to take a look at what we're talking about here. Let's do this clicker question as our final thing for today. After overcoming the initial shock of having her car stolen, Maria is now calling the police. She's questioning possible witnesses. Which stage of the GAS does it sound like she's in? Is that alarm resistance, exhaustion, or adjustment? By the way, one of those four is not one of the stage names. So on Thursday we do personality, the full chapter, and the test is next Tuesday. All righty. For those of you who left, apparently you don't care. The correct answer is resistance. Nice job, guys. I'll see you online on Thursday.